Brut, New Art on Stage.
Welcome to the 25th edition of The Art of Assembly. This podcast is based on a live session on November 15th, 2023 at WASP Working Art Space in Bucharest. Thanks to Andreea Capitanescu for inviting us and making this possible. The Art of Assembly is a nomadic series of lectures and conversations on the potential of gatherings in art, activism and politics. And if you've missed it so far, you might want to check out our website with videos, more podcasts and other material, art-of-assembly.net. I'm very happy to have as guests today Mette Edvardsen and Tino Sehgal, who is joining via Zoom from Venice, and I will introduce both more closely later on. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm the host of this series.
So today's episode has the title Assemblies of Individuals, Live Work in Non-Performance Spaces. And it stems from the idea that, or from the obvious observation that theaters, which we often talked about in the series, regulate space and time for their audiences, and they demand a certain collective engagement. So for me, theater is always related to commitment, to a certain commitment that you have to give, and which is not so easy to break, even if you want to leave or whatever, but also in terms of time. You might fall asleep or be bored, but you don't get so easily out of it. You have to pay basically with your time, with your presence. And that's why there's always a kernel of a community in the theater audience, at least for me, and at least this was one of the premises of this series. Other kinds of venues like museums or libraries are designed maybe more to separate and to isolate even large crowds of people and to promote more liberal ideas of emancipation. So at least on paper, it would be that everybody decides for themselves how long they want to stay and how long they want to engage. At least that's the promise. So today we will look at some artistic approaches to assemblies that take place in cultural spaces that are not originally intended for live work. They are built for the reception of a different kind of artistic genre, a different kind of cultural engagement. So how do these places work? What kind of audiences, participants, spectators do they produce? And what kind of assemblies do they propose or want to prevent? Choreographer Mette Edvardsen is working in different mediums and is looking for soft spaces where discrete performances become a porous part of the environment. In her work, performers and audience are often in more than one space at the same time, and I'm sure we will talk about this. Tino Sehgal has been working as an artist with the DNA of museums and the liberal assemblies created by exhibitions, which he uses for his constructed situations, thin lines that direct attention and gazes, choreographing the paths of the audience. So first, Tino will speak for about 20 minutes, followed by a lecture by Mette, and after that we have time to speak, and also you have time to ask questions or give comments. So welcome again to you, Tino. I will briefly introduce you as the ritual demands. As I already mentioned, you have described your work often as constructed situation, and I guess this already shows that you prefer to avoid descriptions of your work as choreography, theater, dance, or performance art. You studied dance and economics, which is always mentioned when you're introduced because it's apparently so exotic to have somebody who knows something from outside of the art world. And since 2000, you have been constructing live situations in which performers enter into contact with the visitors and spectators by way of movements, conversations, or song. And in 2005, you presented Germany at the Venice Biennial. You had solo shows in museums and biennials like the Guggenheim, Tate Modern, Documenta 13. And in 2013, you were awarded the Golden Lion of the 55th Venice Biennial. So thanks again for joining, and the floor, or better the screen, is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Florian, for the invitation, and also great to see Mette again. We worked together more than 20 years ago, so now it's we're on a screen together, at least for me. You're in a room in Bucharest. I wanted to talk a little bit about this sentence, and which you wrote, like, places which are not originally intended for performance, no? And I think that this sitting in the dark. Also, then it makes it sound like, yeah, theaters are the spaces which are intended for performance. But I wanted to maybe start there also with the development of theater spaces, no? Because they also they change quite a lot through the history of civilization. First of all, theaters are much older format than exhibitions, which I don't know if people think about, but at some point when I was starting to work museums, I realized that there were no museums or exhibitions in antiquity, but there were theaters in antiquity. But these theaters were not in the dark. Yeah. And I think if you look, maybe Florian or some people in the audience, or Mette, you know more about this than me, but the theater in Athens, for example, it comes out of this Dionysian festival, right? So it comes out of a celebration. And what struck me also about the theater in Athens as one of the first really, or like the Greek theaters, is that they're kind of semicircles, So in a way, like in today's theaters, we have this kind of frontal, rarely semicircles. We have like this kind of antagonism between the stage and the auditorium. They're kind of in a face-off. Whereas if you go to Athens or somewhere in Greece, you see these first theaters, they're more in a semicircle, which to me seemed always like half a step from like a straightforward celebration where people are just like assembling, or like today we have it on parties where you're just like on the same plane. And to me, what was interesting when I saw the theaters in Greece is that the people can still see each other, right? They're in a semicircle, so they see what is going on, but they also see each other, like in a stadium today. And also this development, that's why I found it curious, but also somehow fitting and not, that now the people who have come to this event in Bucharest, that they are in the dark. Because that's something very recent, in the history of theater, that people are quiet and that people are sitting in the dark, has something to do with the rise of like, at least in Germany, it's a rise of this kind of, like Stadttheater, city, like, I think even like, I think it's 100 or 150 years ago that these things happen, or maybe even less, like that somehow these theaters are less social spaces, but it's also a form of individualization. So later we'll talk about how maybe the spaces that Mette and I work in, that they may be more prone to an individual addressal, but in a way the darkness and the silence is also a testament to the process of individualization. If you say one of the main characteristics of modernity is this kind of process of individualization, meaning people understand themselves first and foremost as themselves, like I am I, and not I am a Catholic, or I am a French person, or I am, the husband of, it's like I am first of all Tino, like that's what individualization means, to not just use this abstract word. And so I think the darkness and the quietness, and like if you go to stadiums, you still see like how culture used to be. In cinemas also a little bit. Cinemas are in the dark, but you can still eat. Don't talk, but you eat. So in theaters, we don't talk, we don't eat, and we're in the dark. We don't really see each other, right? So in stadiums, you can be loud, you can talk, and you can eat, right? And so has it something to do with a kind of more rationalistic European bourgeois culture, this kind of being quiet and being silent and not being able to really interact. And so it comes with this like, enlightenment, post-enlightenment kind of rationalizing of behavior, civilizing behavior, as they call it, like in sociology. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, how the museum fits into that. But all of this to say, like, places which were originally intended for performance, I think it's a good sentence. But on the other hand, I don't think, it's not such, I mean, every place which is intended for human action is like there's only, I mean, humans build places which are built for human action, which you can also always behold or watch or something, no? And also these theaters, I think what I want to call attention to, these theaters come out of celebrations. Something that struck me with Greek theater was also the choir, which is very much theorized, that there's always this choir which somehow represents the crowd watching. But the crowd also would scream and shout and like intervene. I've seen that few times in my time when I went to see theater a lot, that like happened a few times in very long shows, that people would get upset in the 90s and like shout into the room. Not often, but it occurs. But that's how I imagine it would be a lot. They would like cheer, like how people in the stadium cheer, you know? So I think these spaces also, I think my first point is that these spaces are never static. They are always kind of changing and developing over time. And if they're for humans, which most places that humans build, this is banal, but it's also, I think, important, they are always for some kind of human action and interaction. And so when you come to the history of museums, which is a much shorter history, for example, one of my, people that I follow, let's say, is the sociologist, museum studies person, Tony Bennett. And for example, his viewpoint is very different than the viewpoint of art history. So you can say art history sees museums as a repository for artworks, right? Like that's the mainstream version. What is a museum? A museum is a container, basically, where you show these things that we call artwork, and it's there to conserve them and present them. But like Tony Bennett or Carol Duncan, or also younger people like Helen Risley, like who work in this field called museum studies, they have a different perspective, which is maybe summed up best in Tony Bennett's sentence, where he says that the artworks in a museum are props for the performance of the visitors. That's a literal quote. Props for the performance of the visitors. So it is a place for performance. Like just to reply to your sentence originally. So in Tony Bennett's sense, so a museum study sense, like the museum is a place for performance, but it's a performance of the visitors. And what is this performance? It's like you wrote a little bit, it's like an individualizing thing. Individualized means I can come and go whenever I want. I can choose to look or not. I can choose to look how long. I can choose to look at the artwork or at other people. Individualizing means that like when, and this was really intended by social reformers, like if you look at, for example, the founding of the National Gallery in London, which was between the East and the West End, it was intended, and also the architecture, this is all Tony Bennett, what he writes about, like the architecture of museums was to single out individuals so that people from lower classes could also observe people from higher classes, how they behave, how they dress, and that the architecture would kind of also frame them. For example, I mean, I live in Berlin. If you go to the Alte Nationalgalerie in Berlin, you could really try this. It's like, it's really a framing, almost like a pic photo, Today, maybe I guess some kind of like Instagramming of people, live Instagramming of people, like architecture shows them. So it was a way of also like practice places, like where you how to behave as an individual. There's a caricature from, I don't know, also like 150 years ago, when museums, like bigger museums, were first started to show up more in Europe, which is very like speaks to this point. In this caricature, which consists of two images, and the first image you see this kind of mob, and this mob is in front of this building, kind of a bit classicist building, and this mob is literally on top of each other. People are like seem drunk and like tumbling over each other, and like in a big kind of huddle choreography, I guess we would say in contemporary dance, and then in the second image you see the same people spread out in a museum in pairs, alone, with the head like this, and nicely comported. So that's a lot what the museum as a kind of, let's say, you could say biopolitical machine or performance space, whatever word we can come up with, that was the intention of the museum, to work on behavior of people. Yeah, even at the time when museums were first built, there were also this, I told you about this caricature, but there were also like drawings or paintings how to stand correctly, like how your body should be in a museum, like how to behave, like stand correctly, how to look correctly, and so this is to say that, like, I mean, these are also places of action, of human behavioral shaping. Like the theater also has gone through a whole development of behavior shaping, also this coming and going. You could easily come and go. Today in a stadium, I recommend going to stadiums because then you can understand a little bit how theaters probably were. Obviously, you can't go back, but like you could come and go if you like. Today, the only person who can really come and go is the director of the theater. If you go in big theaters, like I remember at the Paris Opera, these like intendant loge, like I don't know how to say this in English, Florian, but like the kind of cabin of the director of the theater, that's often really close to the stage, and they can like see from the side, and the reason is that they can come and go. So they're the only ones who have this kind of possibility still to come and go. But this is what people would do. They would it would be a show going on, and it was a much more celebratory and social affair, which I think is, sometimes I feel like we've lost this kind of aspect of like sociality and celebration in what we call theater now. It's a very rationalistic, judging affair. There's like something displayed, like a theater, potentially with a fourth wall. You sit in silence and then you judge it. And then later, the sociality is that later you talk about it with your friend in a kind of, Kant would say Geschmacksurteil, like in a kind of aesthetic judgment. And so for me, let's say, to talk a bit more personally, like Mette and me, we I guess we grew up in this theater field. We worked also together in a theater production. And I started to feel at that time, I think also from my personality, like I was more interested in interaction. And I realized, I'm interested in like the interaction between people. And I felt like theater tends to, at best, display this interaction, but doesn't produce interaction. Like it displays kind of scripted interaction on stage, but it remains very distant and very kind of, to me, I can always fall back to this world antagonistic. So because I was interested in interaction, I guess, and then for many other reasons, which I won't go into now, like I started to do work in exhibitions. And then I realized, because it's a more individualized affair, as you say, there's what I call the Tuesday morning effect. Like in a Tuesday morning, you can walk through a museum and then suddenly you stumble upon a person that I've instructed in a work of mine, and like they involve you into a conversation, for example. And if you compare that Tuesday morning situation, for example, there's a work of mine called This is Exchange, which was the first social work, like social in the terms of interaction work I did. And then basically they offer you half of the entrance fee to the museum if you have a conversation about market economy with them. Yeah. And if you think about the same thing on a theater stage, even with 100 people, let's say, which is not, the biggest theater, and then you say like, okay, somebody wants to have half of the entrance fee, then, and have a conversation up here with me on stage, like immediately I have to change my voice. And like these people are put on display. Like nobody, it's almost metaphorical. You get dragged on stage, you get put on the spotlight. And suddenly it's not only about interaction only, but more importantly, it's about being presented. Then I realized, like, among many other reasons, I could actually do real interaction in the sense of like not interaction plus putting somebody on display, dragging somebody up on stage, kind of always running the risk of embarrassing them or making them do something in front of other people which they didn't actually choose to do. No, they walk into a space, they're on their own, they meet another person. It's a one-on-one situation, and that's it. Or even 2-on-1 or 3-on-1, like 3 visitors, 1 person of mine. And I could play with interaction in a way which I couldn't on a stage, no? And plus, going back and then I'll finish, plus this fact what I said in the beginning, that the stage itself in its history in Europe the last 200 years became more and more kind of antagonistic, frontal, silent, rigid in a way. It was less of a social space, less of a pretext for a social gathering. It was more like, okay, you sit and you think and you judge, or let yourself be entertained or whatever. And so that space was for me a little bit too collective and too not enough space for actual interaction. I think it's possible to do that, but it's much more effort than in a museum where the people are already individualized, and there's also at times less people around. Because what a theater does is, and this is my last sentence, I don't want to go over time here, but like what a theater does, in technical terms, in terms of assembly, because this is the topic here, it brings the amount of people who are interested in this particular piece together at one time, no? Whereas what a museum does, it says the piece is here and you can come over weeks and months, yeah? So of course, there's at any given moment, there tends to be less people, in a museum than in a theater, and also that there's not this energetic intensity. Of course, depends on which scale you're talking. And in the Louvre right now, there's probably more people than in our theater here, but at a comparable art center, then there will be, over the course of a week will be more, but in a given moment, probably less in a room, no? In a given room. Was it clear what I was trying to say, or do you have a question for me to clarify, Florian?
I think for now it's fine. We keep it. Let's bring. I have a lot to say and a lot to ask, but I think let's bring Mette's talk into the conversation, and then we dive a bit deeper into it. I was just also just a bit thinking about the foyers in theater and how that in terms of the time of changing that you described in the 19th century, what role the foyer actually might play also in watching audiences. But now I would I just thank you for now, and would like to introduce Mette Edvardsen a bit more closely. Mette is a choreographer and performer, often connecting other media and formats such as video, books and writing to performing arts. A retrospective of your works was presented at Black Box Theatre in Oslo in 2015 and at MACBA in Barcelona in 2018. And your project Time Has Fallen Asleep in the Afternoon Sunshine, which we will hear a bit more about in a moment, is ongoing since 2010 and has been presented in festivals from Brussels to Sydney, Hong Kong or Sao Paulo, and is at the moment also can be seen here for the next couple of days if you don't have a ticket yet. For this work, a group of people dedicate themselves to memorizing a book of their choice. Together they form a library collection consisting of living books. You currently are having a long-term research residency at Le Laboratoire de Revue in Paris. And last but not least, you run a small publishing house, Varamo Press, together with Jeroen Peters, and I'm very happy that you are here.
Okay. So, I will speak from about this work specifically, and to try and address some of these topics of the assembly through that example. And I will follow a bit my notes that I have prepared to not, because I was saying this before, it's a work that's been developing in so many formats to try and keep a bit the focus. So now you just said shortly what this project, Time Has Fallen Asleep in the Afternoon Sunshine, is this a group of people that memorize books by heart. So to say that so a short introduction then, the title of the project is a sentence from Ray Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451 from 1953. Maybe some of you know it. And in this future vision of society, books are banned and an underground community of people learn books by heart in order to preserve them for the future. So this has been the base for the project. We decided to develop learning by heart as a practice and an ongoing activity, in the sense that there's nothing final or material to achieve. It's a continuous practice of remembering and forgetting. And since this start in 2010, it has taken place in 92 different city libraries, and with a growing number of book titles, 132 by now, in English, French, Arabic, Dutch, Norwegian, Greek, German, Polish, Estonian, Swedish, Danish, Greenlandic, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Cantonese, Mandarin, Korean, Latvian, Russian, and Romanian. So after some years, also different aspects of this project developed along parallel tracks, in addition to the ongoing process of learning books by heart and reciting from memory. Some of us started rewriting the books from memory to bring the spoken version of the books now existing in the memory back to paper. And from this now, a series of 10 editions has been published, all of which are unique books in the sense that they reveal different methods and poetics used in the original writing and also in the process of learning it by heart. And for this, the project acted as the publishing house for these editions. We have also been experimenting with what we call second-generation books, where we teach our books to others via oral transmission. So someone, for example, will be learning my book, I Am a Cat, not from the pages, but from me speaking it, passing it on orally to them. The project has over the years also collected its own small library collection and archive, a smaller series of singular contextualizing writings self-published as after editions, as well as numerous talks, seminars, presentations, and also, and for me this is an important part maybe can come back to, but including encounters with other artworks, artists, and practices. And so now I will zoom out a little bit to the larger context that is, for me, important around the work, because it's time and memory are kind of central figures, and then I'll come back to space. So Time Has Fallen Asleep is an anachronic project in many respects. This impression of belonging to other times comes from the values that lie beneath the project and that give it their specificity, other than the ones currently predominant in our societies. A practice of dedicating countless hours to learn existing books by heart could seem to contradict all the governing principles of our understanding of human endeavor since modernity. Both as an artistic practice and as a vital enterprise, it seems to be an obvious and inexcusable waste of time. Nothing new is brought into the world, no new ideas to change or improve the state of affairs, no new image to help us better understand our problems, no new cultural product to expand our perception and sensibility. To learn a book, one does not need the most appreciated values in our society: originality, creativity, innovation. Moreover, learning a book by heart is a solitary practice. It does not help the reader to achieve an improvement of the capacities fundamental in the times of cognitive capitalism, such as relationality, communication, mobility, flexibility. So what then does has fallen asleep have to offer? An unspectacular practice that rejects to submissively obey these imposed values and principles, a project that distrusts the imperative of the new, the economy of efficiency, the urge for innovation, the subordination and instrumentalization of the present in the interest of the future. Its insistence on practice rather than on goals, objectives, and results implies that its attitude towards these other values is not one of mere opposition. It does not consist in a negative gesture of accusation, but it is a project that favors and promotes a series of values and principles that our society has decided to ignore, such as sustainability, continuity, care, time. In its 13 years of life, the project has generated and continues a continuous, although intermittent, environment according to alternative logics, economies and principles, a space-time for people to engage in a vital practice that shapes their subjectivities and creates new communities. One essential human capacity is memory, a faculty that has been discredited and marginalized in every realm of our society, be it education, research, labor, politics. It has been externalized from the bodies and entrusted to external apparatuses and devices, up to a point in which it has been degraded to social irrelevance. But it is relevant today to cherish it as a fundamental element that allows to keep imagination alive, that enables us to project and create alternatives to the hegemonic present as an essential social and political tool for dissidents, for sustaining our realities against general amnesia, the greatest political threat. The current understanding of memory has been reduced to sheer information, abstracted from the bodies, that can be digitalized, downloaded, stored, and installed at will. But human memory is not equivalent to digital memory. Data are not equivalent to remembrances. On the one hand, a document, an image, can only have sense when it is related to a feeling, a story, a narration, when it is invested with meaning. On the other hand, a fundamental mechanism of human memory is oblivion, as it fosters a process of selection, organization, and reconfiguration of the past, so every time it can be made useful for our present. To discredit human memory in favor of an externalized one, able to preserve intact every item, implies dismissing our past to unintelligibility. The increasing disassociation of memory from bodies is threatening. The cultivation of the faculty of memory in time has fallen asleep might be insignificant in scale in relation to the predominant trend of discrediting human memory, but still perhaps essential as one of the voices and practices that devise alternatives that protect and cherish other values different to the hegemonic ones. Time. So what allowed the project to live is that we arrived at the shared understanding of what it means to sustain the reality of a practice over time, rather than invest in momentary idea or representation of a practice. This understanding is modest and radical at the same time. Thanks to the different hosting venues over time, like was here in Bucharest, we could gradually grow to where we are now, with bookshop, a publishing house, more than 100 living books in 20 languages across Europe and beyond, workshops, exhibition formats, lectures, and talks. And underlying all this is an ongoing practice of making time to memorize and read out loud to each other and visiting readers. The project is founded in a practice as an activity that does not necessarily lead to any objective, but is something we do over an extended time, and perhaps there is no end to it, where the value of something is in itself rather than for something else. The relationship to time is the most radical asset of the project. Time not only as duration, but what qualities are attributed to time. Time has fallen asleep makes no clear delimitation between process and result, but considers both aspects as one and the same ongoing process equal time. The artwork, Time Has Fallen Asleep, is not one thing that is repeated each time the project is presented. It is a mode of working. It is not just a repetition of a format already presented previously, but it is a work that continues being itself, advancing, discovering, encountering, developing. The practice of learning by heart and everything that has been discovered and developed from this activity could only have happened with time. It's not about time, but the project continues to evolve and grow with time. It takes time and it gives time. And then now to space. So the sentence, the title, Time Has Fallen Asleep in the Afternoon Sunshine, is what Guy Montag, the protagonist of Fahrenheit 451, reads in a glimpse of a page as books are falling down upon him during a raid the firemen make in an old woman's house. They're pulling out all her hidden books to burn them. And he is literally struck by poetry, and this becomes his turning point in the novel. And for me, this was important to give the project a title, not just call it The Living Books or Library of Living Books, as if to say that it's not just a format, it is an artistic project. So time is the subject in the sentence then, and it has fallen asleep, can relate to the inactivity or the not productive state, as I have referred to earlier, and also in the afternoon sunshine suggests the time of the day where not so much is going on, in the more unambitious, at least in terms of storytelling, time of the day. So I didn't analyze the title in this way to begin with. It's not directly suggested in this way. It is a sentence that relates to the book that was one very important source for the work. The first time the project took place, it was within a performing arts festival in Leuven in Belgium. And my idea was that we would become books, not to play or represent books, but somehow more literally to learn a book by heart in order to become it, like the book people in the end of Fahrenheit, and then later to recite to readers. For this, it seemed to me that a library would be a suitable place to read and to meet up. So the library was not chosen as a backdrop or a scenery or of symbolic value. It was more practical and functional. We go to libraries to read or borrow books. What context would better provide for this situation of book plus reader, where the aim is to create a reading experience and where the books can also hang out, practice, and wait for their readers. Reading books, so paper books or e-readers, etc., can take place anywhere, and the same goes for the living books in Time Has Fallen Asleep. But to propose it as an artwork, a project, a performance, we needed to organize it somehow. In the library, the audience or visitors or readers could show up and there would be books, so performers, available to bring them somewhere in the library to recite for them. I wanted to work with the format of the book as medium, and reading a book is a solitary activity, at least mostly, and although this, of course, has also been different throughout history. And I was interested in this space of reading both from a choreographic point of view and as experience. And I think that this also connects to intentions in other of my works that are for the stage, where I address internal spaces, imagination, listening, and language, but I will not speak about that at this point. So libraries, however, are not a precondition for the work to be presented. For instance, when we presented the work in Palestine in 2011, the library we were introduced to at first would not be open for everyone. So in the end, we chose together with the people that invited us that we would do the project in a bookshop, which was accessible and open to anyone and seemed better suited for that reason, to not make it exclusive and where the library becomes more this symbolic value. So both reader and a book, they sit together or walk in a library, a bookshop, a museum, or a park, not in isolation, but in a space which is open for anyone to access and where life is going on around. They are together for some time, the two of them, within a larger space where there are others doing other things. This seems to be an important premise for the situation, that we are not in a closed space, for example, then in the theater, isolated away from the outside world, but inside of it, part of it. And this is where, for me, this notion of the soft spaces come from, that these are spaces that we cannot look for. They are partly abstract, but we can try to create conditions for these spaces to appear. The soft spaces refer to the different spaces the reader, in this context, oscillate between. So it's at the same time the space of the library, with its ongoing life, where book and reader become an integral and partly invisible entity. It is the space of the performance between the book performer and reader audience. It's the space of reading and the spaces in the book, so from the writing itself or the content and where we go in reading. So as a performer, as a book, I can never know where my reader is at any given moment. I mean, she might be sitting in front of me, but I cannot know where she's going in her internally. The reader moves and drifts freely between these different soft dense spaces. And this is also true when the reading is taking place outside of library spaces. The point here, I think, is about what are the conditions for being in a certain space, what are the conventions or expectations, even instructions. What is beautiful with libraries specifically is that they are free public spaces. You can just be, spend time there, and of course also read. They are open often for long hours in the day, almost every day. And time inside is not regulated. There is no dramaturgy or prepared circulation in terms of time or even space. So the format or media of the books exists between us. We could be anywhere, both for practicing, like we don't need to be in a dance studio, can be anywhere, and also for the encounters. The encounters are not bound to or choreographed inside of specific spaces. So they are soft, we carry them within us, we create them between us. The context is implicit in the performer, in the book, doing the work, and it or she, he carries these soft spaces within itself. You could say that they're somehow transgressing real space. And if libraries are our preferred spaces, it's because they are spaces that can easily accommodate us. They host us naturally. The infrastructure is in place. We find our place as books easily, without asking us to consume, to move through or be in the space in a certain way. And of course also to be in company with other fellow paper books is also a nice aspect. And then just as the last thing to say that from visiting many different libraries over these years, for me it's also been very interesting to see the role that these libraries have in society or in the place they have in the city. And in my experience, there is no other space that brings such a wide range of its inhabitants together in a place. It's a different kind of collectivity that is being practiced.
Thanks a lot. So I would, if you allow, I would maybe we have a couple of questions. I take the privilege that I have sitting here to ask some questions that I'm interested in first, and then we would open it up quite soon if you have comments or questions. But I would maybe forget the question that I prepared, but like start where you just ended, where you said like could be anywhere, and I was thinking that in a way, if I wanted to juxtapose your two practices, one thing might be, correct me if I'm wrong, but you say you wanted the performers to turn into books in the beginning. That was the initial moment. and the library is basically the organic place, the logical place, so to say, for that to happen. Right, Tino, your performers, your dancers, you don't want to turn them into sculptures or pictures, paintings, if I understand right. But you use the space that suggests a certain perception of a work where people are used to see sculptures or paintings. So in a way that's almost a different direction from which you enter the institution. I wonder about that. So maybe you could talk a bit about, because you said it doesn't matter really where it happens. At the same time, you ended with libraries are specific places. So maybe you could say something a little bit about what happens when you do it in another space. And Tino, you perform sometimes in other spaces, but you stick to the museum very much. But for example, I don't know if it was the only exception, but you also perform, like at the opening of the Volksbühne in Berlin with Chris Derkon, you were performing in the theater space. So you also work in other spaces. So what does that do to the work?
I mean, I feel quite uncomfortable. Like, I feel quite uncomfortable with exhibitions and with theaters, That's why I so sympathize with what Mette is saying with this soft space, because I think what I'm uncomfortable with the theater is this kind of rigidity, like you have to be there, you have to stay. If you leave, then you make like you're kind of making a whole scene, and you're kind of and once you understood what it is, you might have to be polite, because you don't want to be, like interrupting other people or even being recognized as the person who's going. So this kind of a little bit like old school traditional collectivity where we all are there together. It's not very like how we are in society today, which is like paradoxical that our society, since like, let's say, industrialization, enlightenment, societies are like the biggest societies that there ever were, like in the 10 millions, like nation states, maybe now even a global society, so for a few billion, but let's say for sure we have like nation state. At the same time, people never understood themselves as so individualized, And the theater is very much like comes from a time where we understand ourselves first and foremost as part of a collective body, as part of the polis. And so I was uncomfortable with the theater for that reason. So when I do stuff in theater, I have a few things like, often I don't use the theater like it's supposed to use. So I let the curtain dance, or let the light dance, or when I did my piece for the Paris Opera, like I think the dancers spent, like the piece was 15 minutes, but the dancers spent like 1 minute passing through the stage, and then they danced in the auditorium close to people. And so, but what I felt uncomfortable with the exhibition was this kind of focus and celebration of objects, that objects are somehow autonomous. And so I think, I made a weird blend of it. And yeah, I'm thinking about what Mette is saying about the soft space. Yeah, like a softer space, maybe, like if I can use that term, because I also felt that I felt like there was too much celebration. Like, if I put it in one sentence, I felt there was too much celebration and hyping of objects, of things, where we had like a sustainability problem. And why are we hyping these things in such a way, putting them in temples, literally putting them on pedestals? But on the other hand, I feel like a bit uncomfortable with this like kind of forced spectacularity or forced entertainment, this antagonism of this face-off, Sometimes, now I don't dare to do it, but sometimes when I talk about this kind of stuff, when I talk about this frontality of theater, like I ask people to stand in front of each other, facing each other, that I ask them, how do you feel? And it's confrontational, it's frontal, confrontational, and also knowing Mette a little bit, from decades ago, like I'm reading into you, Mette, but there was something, and I think also the work we did together with Ballet Labe was always these big stages, big auditoriums, And there's something very like antagonistic and confrontational, which to me is the opposite of soft, like if you do something and if you interact, or before when I was talking, I literally rose my voice when I was talking about the theater, like, oh, now come up on stage, and there's this kind of collective address in the voice, which to me was always too little individualized, but also not soft enough, And then I think if you have this one-on-one conversation, which you have in the Time Has Fallen Asleep, or you have in many of my works, there's a kind of softness which comes in, which is not this kind of, like two parties. Like sometimes it seems to me also like it has this kind of setup, like two armies, like there's the army of performance who's prepared, and then there's the army of audience. I mean, this is a bit drastic example, so please cut this out of the please, out of the, but because now, I've said this before, but now it rings when I say it. I realize it's not the right moment to say this, but to just finish the point, like it has something so confrontational, like it's the opposite of soft. And to me, like there's so much you could do with what, like an aesthetic construction of people, or an aesthetic coming together of people, which celebrations will always have. Like museums haven't existed for long, theaters didn't always exist, but definitely assemblies have always existed. Humans have always assembled, and they didn't necessarily assemble in stadiums or theaters. They assembled somehow, they dance together, they eat together, they sing together, and it doesn't always have to be so antagonistic or like confrontational or frontal. It can also be softer. I don't know if this answered your question, but that's, I think, why I chose to go to these different spaces. Or when I do something theater, I keep a little bit of remove,
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes if I, just for a short moment, I will just skip to reflections of other pieces that I do that are working with this within the theater, classical theater spaces. And sometimes I can find that this gap is actually, it's a productive gap where I feel like there is something to still do, which is how to create a space in such an environment like that, where you are considering this convention or this way of being in the space, orientation in the space, but where we can still experience something there differently. So how, like if I mean, it's not that I'm not thinking about when I'm in the theater, I'm not carrying with me the same idea of the soft spaces that I'm talking about in the library, but still this way of how to create this or how to work with the contract of the audience stage situation in another way. So whether that's where it's not this kind of confrontational, or the kind of address, the social address of the theater, which has a specific way, like what can be other and there I find that I mean, yeah, then it's maybe tuning it, working in other ranges, or experimenting with that form. And I do think that that there's still I mean, the theater in that sense still interests me as a thing to work with, and also it can be changing the setup, but even in staying with that kind of setup. But I think for the one of the things that I was thinking with for the Time Has Fallen Asleep was that obviously if a person memorizes a book and goes to the stage in this way and recites it to plenum, in the plenum situation with a big audience, we cannot get to this kind of sensitivity. We cannot get to this kind of then it becomes theater immediately. I mean, just for the fact that you're addressing a crowd, and it's a very different. And what I found interesting was that when we are practicing with books, and for instance, there was someone who chose Faust, or there was someone who was doing a novel which has a lot of dialogue in it and direct address. Then it was important how to find a way to do this where you don't become, it's not a question of style, but it's a question of when that becomes too performative in the way of theater or movies, you lose the other spaces. So for me, the idea of the soft spaces was also how many of these spaces can we hold at the same time so that they are all floating in there together, and it's for the visitor or the reader, the audience, it's for their kind of reading experience. The moment that we are, let's say, too much going into the performance, then these other spaces, they disappear. And then you can think, well, how weird to perform this monologue alone in the library. I mean, then we're lacking something. So for me, this balance was interesting to see, like, how is it that we can make the readers, the audience, also sensitive, or that they can perceive these, because they are the ones that are traveling between these different spaces. I mean, we are too as books, but it's kind of in that reading experience, which is not something that you can just dictate, but you can try to suggest it. And sometimes I think I can try and take this with me into the theater as well, not exactly in this way, but by trying to think of the situation of the theater, or specifically then in dance, not only as a visual art form, that it's about what I'm looking at. I keep my attention to something is happening in front of me, and it's only about that. But taking away that relationship, it's not so much about what you see in front of you, but it's what you're, like, the experience of the total space. So there's a listening, what you're feeling, memory, imagination, other senses are being engaged and part of the experience. And then I think that the theater can be a very interesting space to develop work. But I don't know if now it's kind of sliding away from maybe your question.
I just thought that it also has to do, I mean, we know that we also talked about the relationship to the audience, or to the visitor, or to the, what do you call them? Is it still an audience then that comes? that in a way there's always a set of rules. You want to first intervene?
No, because these are two really important words for me, and like audience, that you see the whole difference between, let's say, theater on the one hand as a collective space, and exhibitions, or also libraries as more individualized spaces in this word. Like, you could speak of the audience, yeah, like it's singular but a collective body, yeah. So you realize what it's about. It's about creating a collective, and that's its strength, but also maybe, somehow fallen out of its time, and because of that also good in its time. And whereas in exhibitions and libraries or malls and entertainment parks, or everything which has opening hours, you speak of visitors, so it's individuals in the plural. So I think that there you already see that's a very different conception behind it. But that's just, that's my little projection. No, I would say, like when you do the Time Has Fallen Asleep, the way I imagine it, it's more visitors, because it's an individual address, in my way of speaking, It's not anymore an audience.
Hannah Holze in the market for useful knowledge and non-knowledge speaks of clients. So that's also a possibility. Not in your work, I understand. No. But I wonder, like, so when we talk about this relationship, so there are a set of rules as a visitor or an audience member. I come with a certain idea how I should behave, and that's something both of you play with to a degree. So that I have to question maybe also my behavior in the space. And I wonder, so when I come to a performance, when I come to your performance, I what are my expectations, and what kind of rules are necessary for me to understand, and which rules, if I break them, also end the performance. And I think it's rules of the performance that you said. It's maybe rules I learned of how to read a book. Maybe that's already a bit more abstract. It's probably in a close encounter rules of human decency or behavior towards a person that I interact with. So what kind of rules do you find important, or do you try to play with, or to establish?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's the difference of the people that come that already know that they are coming for this because they've seen it in the program, or they are informed somehow. They have maybe reserved a book already, and they might come. I mean, they might still come with their own expectations and things, but there's also the other part of our readers are also people that call upon us a bit by chance because they happen to be in the library, or they happen to, and then they're wondering, what are you doing? Or and then they engage, or even that are, I'd say, reading over the shoulder. You know, I'm in a situation with someone, and someone is hanging out behind the shelves listening in. So there's these different kinds of, in terms of what is the entry into the work. But then it seems like, of course, we prepare a bit what are the different things that we say and do, but it's quite simple. There's not, I mean, I never thought of it as rules, actually. Of course, there's a level of, I mean, if something would be indecent, that we haven't had that experience yet, but that's just like behavior in the public space. And sometimes there is this, when people come, you can feel that there is a kind of a little insecurity or anxiety about how am I supposed to behave? What am I supposed to do now? And also the confusion around the word read that we use to mean different things. Like I will say, you have come to read me. They'll be like, no, I'm not reading. As I don't know, you know, you're reading, meaning you're listening. So there's, and I think it's more like, you know, someone comes, we consider ourselves, we use our, I don't present myself as my name, I present myself as I am a cat by Soseki Natsume. And in the beginning, I am the book speaking, addressing my reader, and then I will recite, maybe find a place to sit or recite. And usually during that moment is when you can feel that the reader is settling in, kind of relaxing into like, okay, it's just this. It's not, you know, I don't have to do something specific, or I can just listen and receive. But we also pick up on this insecurity to begin with, and then we will guide the reader. But I have not experienced that we need to explain much. Of course, it can happen that someone says, okay, I close the book here. And you go like, okay, then that's it. They can do that. But mostly, of course, people are not going to interrupt or disturb, which would be okay. Sometimes it happens that people are talking with, like interrupting in the middle, saying, really? But, or, you know.
It's finally the chance to talk back to a book.
Exactly, yeah. So this happens.
So you like making notes on the side. And
yeah.
I wonder, Tino, there's a sentence that I found in several of your bios online that I think you might have authorized it at some point, where it says about your work that it's inviting the audience to influence the structure of the work. First of all, it says audience, but that's not my point, but like to influence the structure of the work. So how much freedom in interaction does an audience actually have in your work? What are the rules they have to obey? But to change the structure of the work would be quite an impact. So is that a sentence that you would agree on?
I don't know if I authorized the sentence. I have to look it up myself. But often these sentences travel over the years, and then they slightly shift. No? But yes, that it depends on the work. There's some works of mine which are totally set, but then there's others, for example, like this progress, where you have this conversation first with a child, then a teenager, then an adult, and a senior person, where it depends very much. 50% of what is spoken about depends on what you say at the beginning when the child asks you what is progress. Then you give an answer, and then the whole conversation ensues from there. Also, the teenager tells the senior person what you said. They prepare something for you. So it's really like a kind of feedback loop. There was, when I showed it at the Guggenheim in 2010, I think there was a woman who wrote an article who did the piece 6 times, and 6 times she gave a different answer, and then the whole conversation was also very different, And so in that sense, I think it's correct, and that was also something which was for me important on different levels. That there's both in exhibitions and theaters, there's an element of kind of passivity, which is like and then like the more I thought about it over the decades almost, I realized where is the activity in a bourgeois art experience? And a bourgeois art experience, I mean both theater and visual art, or also book reading, literature. And basically you don't really influence, the event or the thing, but you are like kind of receiver, and then your activity is in this aesthetic judgment, And so that's like you applaud, and then you do the judgment thing. And I realized I became less and less interested the older I got in judging, And I thought, why in our culture do we put such an emphasis on judging rather than on a bit more active, And if you look at our economy, and this may be some things which Mette is not so, I don't know, I don't want to talk for you, but you were talking about cognitive capitalism and this kind of stuff. But for me, there's also interesting aspects, which is, for example, this prosumer idea that somehow you are part of the production process, and your preferences, your requirements come into the product. And I always felt like in the art field, like not performing arts, but especially in the museum field, like we were always somehow mirroring or reflecting how production was happening in society, economic production. And I thought, well, I want to do pieces too, which kind of change according to the person, which are in that sense like 4-dimensional. They're not like static, like, and then you receive them, then you can judge them. And so for me, that was quite important. But sometimes I just ask one question. Sometimes the whole piece is like dependent on the visitor. And then some critics it was also interesting when I first did, for example, this progress, some curators or critics, of an older generation, they found it really problematic, because I said, how can I criticize something which I have? So how can I make a judgment of something that I have produced myself, And I think today with the internet and this kind of feedback culture, also in the economy, which, likes, etc., which is not my favorite thing, but like this is more, it's more kind of prevalent to the degree that I think that like even exhibitions and theaters have problems, especially exhibitions, which I know better now professionally, like because it's too static. Like people want somehow to have their say in something. Like we're not used as internet users, we're not used to not having a say, and if you look at the education departments in museum, how they try to open up like the classic bourgeois art experience to people having a say. Okay, often now you see these little papers where people can write something on, stick it onto wall. I mean, it's very, very small and maybe a little bit, not overly successful ways of interacting, but you see that there's a urge for that, or in Paris, I see this a lot, like people go to museums to take photographs of themselves. So they don't even fully, like a younger generation, I did a piece at Bourse de Commerce. For them, this idea that you just go passively somewhere doesn't really make sense. So they come to the museum, it's beautiful, and the museum doesn't really prohibit it. And they're often just like posing and using it as a backdrop for their activity, So I think that's definitely something that I was that I was interested in, but is of course something with an element which is, on the one hand, not part of the bourgeois art experience. On the other hand, it's more part, a little bit more of the exhibition experience, because at least you're talking, you go with a friend, you're talking, you point out things, you're a little bit more active in an exhibition than in a dark theater where you have to be silent.
I guess as an audience, even if I'm part of a collective experience sitting in the dark in the theater, as was said before, also I'm still an individual who is experiencing the piece, and I don't necessarily see that as passive. I'm sitting in whether I'm sitting in the dark or whether I'm sitting in the library, just still listening to someone who is speaking their book to me, or being in the open gallery space where there's, I think that what can open for me in my way of receiving a work, or in my imagination, all the things can be activated in me, makes that, that's like some years ago when there was a lot of focus in theater, at least in the performing arts, in interactive performances. And that would be translated into that as an audience member, you get on stage and you're also, cutting something, and then you feel that you're much more. And for me, this is not that would be a way of suggesting this, that you're part of it, or that the interaction is important. And for me, that could make me feel so unengaging with the work, and not be more participative with the work than actually just sitting still in the dark and going into my anonymity for a moment and just receive and opening up an internal space, or the feeling in the body of receiving a work, depending on what the work is, of course. And I don't think of this as a passive space, and I also don't think of this kind of posting or I don't know if I'm so interested always in being able to come with my output, express myself, or to put something out. It's like, it's beautiful to be able to go through an exhibition. It's some of the works that now it's been some years I didn't see your pieces, but some of the pieces that I have, if I use you as an example, it can be also poetic or emotional responses, beautiful experiences of encountering a work in a context like that shifts something in your way of seeing or perceiving, or makes you sensitive to something, or that opens something. And I take this with me, and it's not about judging. It's also not about my output. It's just something that I take with me.
If I can respond directly, Florian, if we go a bit deeper, like I would say that if you phrase it positively, in the, let's say, what I call for today, the bourgeois art experience, like to put like theater and exhibitions together, there's the activity of contemplation. That's what you're describing, and so this is an activity, imagining, contemplating. And if you want to make this activity of contemplation, if you want to phrase it positively, and I also agree, because like large parts of my work are to be contemplated, and they happen in a kind of bourgeois framework of the exhibition, or even the theater at times. If you want to say it positively, you can say it has a relation to an inner world, to an introspection, to meditation. Like you kind of focus inward, as an energy. If you want to say it negatively, and I think that's also an aspect, it very much participates in a Western mind-body separation. Like, so the mind is active, right? Like what you describe is the activity of the mind. The body is very much passive, like the body is in a theater is stilled, That doesn't mean that like going up on stage, like cutting That's what I was talking about at the beginning. I never was interested in dragging people on stage, but I think there is something about like understanding the human being, not only as this kind of, Cartesian mind, but like, and in our rituals to kind of, because at the end, theater exhibitions are modern rituals, like which were, theater was adapted in a way to be more rationalistic, modern. The exhibition is actually a modern, like invented in modernity or early modernity ritual. It's very much in this mode of thinking of the human being as this head on a kind of unimportant body, or like this separation. And I think today I'm more interested in thinking it as a holistic thing. So I like, for example, when like in this variation, it's like a piece in the dark where people are singing and dancing, that like you can dance, you can listen, but you can dance, and nobody will see you also, and you have the option. So that sense, also taking this liberal moment a bit further, like I don't tell you what to do, but I also don't tell you what not to do, right? That would be my problem. Yes, I can enjoy imagining, but if I want to go like, like laugh loud, that you can maybe still do in a theater, but if I want to somehow express to my friend or stand up and also dance, like we've watched a lot of dance pieces, and your mirror neurons are going crazy. And often when you walk out of a dance piece, you can see people doing the movement afterwards, because their mirror neurons have been like kind of so kind of activated the whole time by watching this dance. And so I like to give the people the option to be more embodied, that if they take it, and I want to give them the option of contemplating also, like most works I've done, like the higher percentage is contemplation, but I don't want to just give them the option of contemplating.
A short comment to that. I think I totally agree with this idea of having more this holistic approach to the experience and to the body. But I don't think that I could perceive a situation where I'm sitting in the dark in the theater and my experience of a performance is not even my contemplation. Everything that is going on, although I'm sitting still in the audience, is not happening in my head only. I'm sensing things. There's kinesthetic experience. There's the sense of presence. I'm present. I'm feeling my body. Or I could say when I'm reading a book, I'm also reading. I'm also in my body. The head is also part of my body. So I think that I agree with this, like not this split between mind and body, but maybe I would think the body part of in another way also, while being still. And I think the example that you're saying about the piece that you did in the dark in Documenta, wasn't it? In the can be also a good example of that, both in the positive and in the negative sense. Like you can say what you're saying in terms that you can participate. You can dance if you want. You don't have to. All these things that it's not the do's and the don'ts. It's open for you. But it can also be. Okay. Then if you don't feel well in that situation, you can also leave. So in that sense, it's a very good example of such a situation. But I don't think it contradicts the fact that we are not splitting the body and the mind also in what you would call a more passive, or as I understand, what you call more passive reception.
I would like if in case you have enough of contemplation, so if you want to comment or ask something, that could be a moment. I know you sit a little bit in the dark, but just to offer the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much for both of your talks. It was really inspiring, interesting. I was really interested in this opposition between, let's say, the modern theater space that becomes this like frontality where the audience as a collective body sits kind of next to each other in this dark space, in contrast to the maybe more original architecture, as you described it Tino, where people would see each other and sit in this circular space. And I was wondering, whilst the former, the more modern order is more privatizing and has this more private feeling of like an individual experience, it also seems to be more equalizing, because when I think of like the traditional opera houses, I mean, the time you went in and the lights were still on, that was a lot about showing and disciplining each other, right? Your status would be shown by the seats you would sit. You would wait to see maybe the monarch, whoever that is, but also things like at the end of the performance, the dancers, the singers would bow to the important people, to the monarch in older times. So I was just wondering whether there's not also a potential in this more privatizing, but also more equalizing order of the room, which then also leads to a different kind of interaction, maybe not during the event, but after the event, because I feel there's nothing more connecting than like collective suffering when you have to sit through a really, really bad performance or show.
I like the word private because I think I talked about individualization. It's true that it's like darkening of the space is also private. Like, you can say history of modernity also has a big strand of like more private. Everything becomes more private, like space becomes more private, experience becomes more private.
I think it's also the question about does it make people more equal in a way? That is by not being visible in the crowd, if I understood right.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big thing. If you look at, for example, I don't know if this is the answer to the question, then stop me if I'm talking about something unrelated. But if you look, for example, at 20th century theaters, they are very, equalized. If you think of Théâtre de la Ville in Paris, it's just like one slope. All seats are the same. Whereas if you think of like older theaters, then they have these loges, then they have a standing area, a parquet, So in a way, it's again a display of society, which most rituals also in other cultures, other times are always kind of enacting also social hierarchies and re-establishing them, So it's clear when you are in the standing pit or in the parquet, or if you're then some theaters, then even royalty had their loge. I don't know how to say this in English, then, and that when the lights were on, I think the person who was speaking was also talking about the lights on, you can see each other and you can see society somehow displayed. And that's especially in Germany, where we had all these kind of, before the German unification to a nation state, we had all these city-states, and it's not by coincidence that like theater is so popular in Germany, and there's so many city theaters, because those were places where these city theaters could display themselves as society.
It came to my mind that equality might be also something, I mean, hierarchies are not only by class and how you dress and so on, but also by knowledge. So for example, like maybe what I said about the rules, but also is there people more comfortable in contact with books than others?
I think that in the kinds of scales where I'm presenting work is usually smaller venues or middle-sized venues. It's not, it's not at the opera. I'm not dealing with that level of, class or social. And sometimes I can sense that from curators or programmers or the point of view of theaters, that they can have this wonder about, not the knowledge, like how will an audience that is uninformed deal with this, or if the work is a bit experimental or something. And often I find that it's not the problem, but maybe I'm not saying that this is true in all cases, but often I find that that we are projecting also this unequal situation. It doesn't have to. It's not always correct when it comes to the book specifically, because also libraries, there's a wider range of people. If I think of the theaters where usually my work is presented, it doesn't represent the same width of the inhabitants of a city than the audience or readers that I meet in libraries, which has a much wider range. And it seems to it seems to be quite easy to understand. Maybe not understand exactly what the experience might be, but to understand the setup. So it does happen that people can come with this expectation of, are you going to dance? And when they understand that it's not exactly, that they would be disappointed or go, but it's it seems like in a situation like this, maybe something is evening out a bit, whether it's an old person who is the habitual of the library that has already its habits, or someone who is there, has never been there before. It's somehow, it's a kind of, I don't know, like how to say that. Most libraries are made in a way that when we enter, we can somehow, it's not so oppressive as entering the foyer of a theater, or it has another. But though I was curious about what you were saying about the collective experience of that you feel, or how that's enhanced in seeing a bad performance. I thought that was kind of, because in a way I would, in my experience, I would think it's the other way around, but maybe I'm just forgetting. I mean, in what way that kind of enhances the sense of the collective?
Well, I feel sometimes when you go out of a room, whether it's a lecture, whether it's a theater piece, and it was really bad, you had this you just know that other people also suffered and had to sit through, and you kind of exchange just looks sometimes, yeah. Which you normally, so you create an interaction that maybe you would normally not do because you're shy and stuff. But because you kind of have this feeling that there is something shared, you're more likely to interact. Maybe that's just my subjective experience, or my hope, because I actually don't know how to get back to the hotel, so I'm hoping for some interaction after this. Not that this is a bad performance.
I think my experience is more like being in the I think a bad performance, and everybody around me being totally excited about it and totally happy. So that's also a way of isolating oneself. Tino, you wanted to add something?
No, I can hear better, and I agree with this, and I'm very interested in this word suffering, because that goes into my perspective that like in the collective, in the theater, there's a kind of rigidity around, you cannot leave, because you cannot suffer if you can just leave, right? Like you have to suffer through it. And I remember friends from the art world, when they would go to theater and hang out with other friends of mine from the contemporary dance world, they would always be really confused and say like, but why are they still talking about this bad piece? And I think they could understand why they talk. If the piece was bad, why do they talk about it for so long? Because that doesn't exist in the art world or the exhibition world. If the piece is not good, you just walk past it. You don't suffer through it, And I said, yeah, because we suffered through it, like we have to kind of get it off our chest, because we were stuck in our seats. So for me, these things were really things that influenced me. And maybe the last thing that I want to say on this topic, which is important to me, is that I think because I have these kind of issues with both formats, let's say, that I grew up with, the exhibition format and the theater format, I think what I'm most interested in, I think which is really important also for like 21st century society, is to create new formats which are somehow less rigid than theater, but energetically more bonding, more intense than exhibitions, because exhibitions are quite cold, quite non-committal, quite unsocial. We don't meet people, and more going to the direction of contemporary communities. And so I've been working a little bit on that, where there's places where people can come together, but they can also leave at the same time. And I was invited to think about that because of the library. And then I was invited during COVID times to a panel, and it was like also a woman invited to this very innovative library in Cologne, or I was in Tilburg. And then there's also this huge library as a meeting place. So it's like libraries and exhibitions are also maybe libraries more because you really arrive at a library where you pass through an exhibition more, like you actually hang out. But libraries have in a way lost their function a little bit because you can research everything at the internet. So I think the social dimension of libraries has risen. And I think more and more libraries are becoming these places where you can hang out in an individualized manner and actually becoming, I'm not an expert at this, but I've heard it like left and right a little bit, like places where people can be and meet, which are not places where you have to buy something, but you can be there and you can see other people. And a friend of mine was telling me yesterday, and it reminds me of this library thing. He said, like, apparently Tate Modern did kind of survey, and they did it 3 times because they couldn't believe the result. They just asked the people one question, like, why did you come here? And people always said, like, the majority of people said, to hang out and to be where other people are. And so the curators were shocked, and they were like, well, that doesn't actually matter what we're doing, which, could be a longer discussion, probably not true, but that was their first reaction. That's why they did the survey again and again. But I think also the screen-dominated world and a more private world, people look for places where they can somehow be together. But of course, we are private individuals, We're not necessarily so easily like coming together with everybody. There's also, we live in cities. A lot of us, like, we're not so open also, but it's also nice to energetically be around people. So I think that there is a need for that, but I really think that we will need new cultural formats. And the library in this new form is maybe going in that direction, but I think there can also be more inventive ones where people can be, but be in an embodied way, in a social way, but also not. Like, you could talk to somebody in the library, but you don't have to,
I mean, just to say on this, for me, it was interesting to see the rate of libraries. I mean, in these 13 years, I've seen libraries closing, which has also been a problem of like underfunded libraries or then new libraries, but also how libraries are changing, and of course the different kinds of communities that they are hosting and the different kinds of activities that libraries are kind of behind is also quite astonishing. It's I mean, it's like you say, places to meet, but there's all kinds of different activities that you can do in the library.
There's a programming.
Yeah,
it's like daytime programming.
Next to
Something that I've done at music festivals, or also in New York, we did a project which is basically opening hours daytime programming to make it short. That's what libraries are doing, like daytime programming with opening hours.
But also like social things like taking care of homework, support for kids, taxi drivers.
That's what I mean with programming. They program these different modules.
Yeah.
But in Manchester, there's sewing machines. They have 10 sewing machines. I would just, was a question or comment in the back there. Sorry to interrupt.
So thank you. It was very interesting. I have a question regarding interactivity again and finding new formats that could be able to create this kind of temporary communities. And I was wondering, what do you think of games as a medium, or if you ever think of your work as a game or as a playful activity?
Do you understand, Tino? Was it about the question if you both think of your work also in terms of games? So what would game be also a space or create a space, I guess, for what we are talking about?
As a medium.
It's formative.
For me, it's a central category. One of my first jobs was working with Xavier Leroy, and it was like just before I was in the same project as with Mette, and it was all about like inventing new games. And then when I tried to make this short, but this is like one of the central categories for me. And then a lot of my work are game structured. So it's somehow a set of rules in which the dancers, singers, or academics, or whoever's doing the work can play. And so that is also a way where they can bring in their individuality without that it's like they're redefining the structure of the work. They're like players in a existing game which I've constructed. So that's my part and they don't really have a say in it. And then they enact the work and I don't really have a say in it, you know? So that's also the kind of collaboration, let's say, but on different levels. And me, I was very influenced by John Zorn's Cobra, which is like a kind of, you know, peaceful kind of orchestra, and the instrumentalist suggests things to the conductor, who then becomes more like a moderator. They hold up these cards, and then I started to think, how can I do that? Maybe without cards, but without the moderator. But I think also that in general, sports and games are very much, also interesting places where all kinds of things happen at the same time. You know, like when we had our conversation earlier, and I totally hear your point, Mette. But I was then, while you were talking about this internal thing, I don't know if this relates to the question, I was thinking about, I was invited to go to see a football match in Turkey, in Istanbul. And I was sitting like you would be, maybe, like being in my internal space, watching, taking this whole scenery in. But like 5 meters away from me, or 3 meters away from me, was this, I would say she was like late teens, early 20s. She was on her own. And she had a shawl. She was like dressed as she came from studies or came from the office. Then she probably had like a kind of scarf on. And for me, it was fascinating because she was just shouting at the players the whole time. Like, but for, I don't know, from the 90 minutes, maybe like 60 minutes, she was shouting at them. And with nobody else to interact or support her, I was like, oh my God, how courageous, shouting onto the field. And like, I was just like mesmerized. And I thought, well, after this 90 minutes, I mean, she's a different person. She really got something out. I mean, she exercised something, you know, and that's a different kind of bodily thing that happens in that moment. Now, is it good, or is it, you know, whatever? But that's what I meant also earlier. So I don't know if it relates. Sorry, I can't see you, but like, to the person who made the comment, like, I don't know if this relates to what you were saying with games, but maybe Mette can answer in a better way. She heard it also.
Yeah, I think it follows up along. Good, yeah. I was thinking of another. I mean, just to I don't have so much to add on games or gaming, but another format that strikes me as something that is transforming quite a bit is also concerts. So the large scale concerts and the kind of the use of multimedia or media, video, active. I mean, I don't, you know, my experiences from big concerts are from some years ago, not so much the recent. But it feels like there's something there also in terms of performativity and these kinds of performance events. That is maybe developing a new form somehow. Yeah.
Another question or comment? Otherwise, we probably should also slowly come to an end. Maybe with one last question that I was wondering when we were talking. I thought, like, okay, if we would have the same conversation 20 years ago, so something like your beginning of your practice and mine as well, this would have been very different. And I was thinking of some things that you said, Tino, where I thought like, but now with basically no museum without performances in there anymore, and also no theater without participation. I'm exaggerating, but the trend, of course, like a lot of interest in participation in theater, in breaking up the space and so on, a lot of interest in performance and living bodies in museums in the last 20 years. I mean, last 10 years maybe, but for quite a while now. Did the premises of your work change in this time? And maybe, Tino, you were already hinting with your interest in ritual or other spaces in this direction. So how much by the change of society, the change of also wanting to participate, you were talking about participation in exhibitions, about making photos and so on, but also about changing of the art, the practices of theaters, museums and other venues. How much does that have consequences for how you work?
I mean, short answer, I would say, like, I like your idea of, like, if we had this conversation 20 years ago, I would say, would it be different? I would say yes and no. I think that I did have similar feelings about these things and thoughts about these things. And then I think that, like, if theater is now so participatory, maybe I have to go more to theater with you than Florian. and also the exhibition world has become also quite traditional. It's a lot of painting and sculpture, even installation is kind of, I don't know how it's in Bucharest, at Mare or something, but like in European museums, also a thing of budget and budget structures. It's very much like back to painting and sculpture, and not even installation anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think also that some things are still very close, and there's also I have a sense of that there's waves. That I don't know if that's a terrible thing when you feel like you can, you realize that you start to recognize ways of things coming back, which is of course part of my experience now, whether it's from what's happening in the scene, but also the practices from theaters and how they are dealing with artworks and performances, and
Can be also quite comforting, hoping that some waves will end again. Might be a comforting thought. Thanks so much. I think it's quite interesting, and I think if we would continue talking about libraries with other people, it could be also interesting. I think it's quite interesting of thinking how these spaces try to transform and maybe to actually facilitate to some of the things we were talking about. So I think maybe there should be an addition on libraries as well. Something that came to my mind, but we will not get into it, but just to mention it as possible thread for this conversation as well, was when you were talking about memory, which in both of your works plays a role, I guess, a certain kind of memory, imagination, but also how you contract things, via memory, and how memory and imagination and maybe intimacy and these things are related to each other. Also for another time. For now, I really thanks so much to you both for joining. Thanks for listening. I do the small advertisement block. If you're interested, the next edition of The Art of Assembly will be on the 30th of November in Oslo, but also on a live stream, and we will deal more with the question of how sound and sound creates spaces and gives certain conditions for assemblies, or prevents assemblies, or creates certain kinds of gatherings. So thanks so much, and hope to see you again.